It's Wednesday, January 15th, 2020, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simmons, and here with me are my colleagues, Kiely and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, now that the royals have had their emergency summit and there's an agreement that Harry and Meghan will be making their life in North America, it's a good time to look at the way they've been treated in the press, here and on the other side of the pond. Oprah Winfrey says she's out of that documentary about the Me Too accusations against Russell Simmons, and that it won't be running on Apple Plus anymore. We'll talk about why. And the Oscar nominations are out, and it's the whitest and most male list of bids since 2015, the year that we started recognizing #OscarsSoWhite. We've got a lot more, though, than just celebrity news for you this week. There's a lot more we want to start with, including this morning, the articles of impeachment, the vote, moving them from the House to the Senate, and one of our own Missouri senators, Roy Blunt, at the center of some of these rules and how much we're going to be able to see of these proceedings in the coming days, weeks, and possibly months.
Yeah, this is disturbing, and a lot of reporters in Washington are kicking up a fuss about it, and I think legitimately so. Now, Senator Roy Blunt is the chair of the Senate Rules Committee. And like most Rules Committee chairs, I suspect he is doing the bidding of his leader, Mitch McConnell. But he's set up some rules for press coverage, which it sounds like are going to exclude reporters from the chamber for where this is actually being tried for extended periods of time. The Senate can do closed sessions, and it sounds like they will do that a lot. And then additionally, reporters are going to be restricted in their movements within the Capitol. So it will become much harder for a reporter to dash up to a member of the Senate and say, what did you mean by that, or what's happening? And this really, there's no reason to do this because reporters all have, security is what's being cited as the reason. But anybody who has a press pass for the U.S. Capitol has gone through a criminal background check. And so to use these very passes that are supposed to give you access to deny you access seems to me to be highly suspicious and to suggest that what the senators are really afraid of here is questions.
Yeah, I mean, what I find very fascinating is that he's basically citing the rules that were used during Bill Clinton's impeachment. But as we all know, the media landscape has changed significantly since the 1990s when all of that occurred. And so for him to come out and say, well, there's precedent here, that makes no sense. I'm in agreement with you. I think a lot of this is to try to figure out a way to control the narrative so that certain parts of the media or certain aspects of the news media are denied access, and then those who are in charge of this can basically spin it the way they want.
Yeah, and the other thing is I covered Bill Clinton's impeachment, and reporters were never held in pens in the Capitol, which is what's being talked about here. So I think one of the glories of the Capitol has been how hard members of both parties have worked to maintain public access in the face of real security threats. And after 9/11, when the White House was pretty much locked down, members of Congress really worked hard to keep that building open because it is the people's house. And what listeners and viewers need to understand is that this isn't just a matter of the press being denied access. We're there to report for you. So when we're denied access, you're denied access.
So you talk about access and denial of that access. There was an open letter that was sent earlier this week from 13 former White House press secretaries and government officials calling on Stephanie Graham to start meeting with reporters, to hold a press briefing, and to offer some transparency. And I guess my first question is 310 days now without a briefing. Why bother? What makes these 13 people think that having this open letter out there is going to make any difference?
I thought the same thing myself. I don't think it's going to make any difference. I remember specifically us having this conversation.
We've had it many times.
But in the conversation that sort of was at the top of my mind
Yeah.
was the one we had when all of a sudden the press briefings became shorter, they were less frequent, and I think it was Mike McKean said, this is the beginning of the end of the press briefings, and here we are. You know, as you said, over 300 days have gone past since we've had the last one, and I'm going to be honest. I don't think it's going to come back regardless of who's in the White House. I just don't see it.
You know, I'm not sure it's a bad thing that press briefings themselves have gone away in their current iteration. I think even one of the signers of that letter, Mike McCurry, who was the press secretary for Bill Clinton, has said publicly numerous times that he regrets televising the White House press briefings because it very much changed the nature. It became much more of a showboat kind of thing and a point-getting kind of thing and not a conversation. So the fact that those briefings are gone is not so bad. But the idea that I think it's less important whether press secretaries are out there in front of a camera, and more important are the principals out there in front of the camera, the president, the secretary of state, the secretary of defense. I mean, obviously, these are very busy people. That's why they have press secretaries, because they can't answer every question from every reporter. But once in a while, they should go before cameras and people with notebooks who are asking questions on behalf of the public. And that is the thing that really is disturbing. It's not whether the press secretary himself or herself stands up there. And I think it's a little unhealthy how much focus there's been on those individuals because they're not elected. But the fact that the elected officials or their appointees who are paid by the taxpayers to respond to taxpayers are not doing so, I think is what's disturbing.
And I think the other thing is that, and you've seen this over the course of the last 3 presidents, including the president, occupier of the White House, fewer and fewer press conferences involving where the president is actually in front of the White House press corps answering questions that really need to be answered in a way that is not part of some sort of political theater, which is the way we've seen it, not just from this president, but from the last 2 presidents before him.
And at least the last president before him, in the Obama administration, we saw the rise of Twitter and other social media platforms where presidents don't necessarily need us to be able to speak to the populace in the way that they once did. And by simply reserving their comments for those channels, they aren't taking those questions.
But what people need to realize is that their questions aren't getting asked either.
Right.
It becomes a one-way conversation with the people in power delivering their message, but nobody ever getting to say why.
Right.
Our next topic was one that almost didn't make the show today until I made a connection between 2 seemingly unconnected things and kind of brought that up to Kathy. There's a new policy in place at the Scripps television station in Cincinnati, and new legislation under consideration in New Hampshire. Let's start with Cincinnati, where the news director at WCPO-TV announced on the station's website that it is going to no longer be using police mugshots on its air or digital channels unless the police are 1, still looking for a suspect, or 2, believe that there is the belief that there might be additional victims who might come forward if they see somebody on TV who had hurt them in the past. There's also a third case where they're going to, which isn't part of the official policy, that if somebody has a very common name, so say John Smith gets arrested, they're going to use John Smith's mugshot so that you aren't thinking about that other John Smith. These photos are usually people at their worst, sometimes having been beaten or bruised, being intoxicated. And the news management at this station figured that perhaps they're doing a disservice by putting those photos out there, especially when cases get pled down or cases aren't made.
Go ahead.
Yep, this is really following a policy that's been in place for a long time at the Columbia Missourian right here. And our colleague Catherine Reed is very passionate about this, and I think with good reason. You know, it's not just people not looking at their best, but sometimes people get arrested for no reason. And you might be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this use of mugshots has become really popular because it's easy to do now. In a digital age, you can just do an RSS feed from the police department and put these up there. But as I often like to tell students, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And so sometimes innocent people can be held up there, and some terrible recidivist, homicidal maniac or rapist is given the exact same play as somebody who was arrested because they were protesting. Mm-hmm. It looks the same. So I think we need to start using our news judgment and not letting the machines take over.
I think the other reason that they cited was that the way in which these mugshots appear, because most of them appear in crimes having to do with either violence or robbery and also domestic violence. So a lot of it is revolving around poverty, revolving around race, revolving around all of those social issues, and it begins to create this sort of stereotypical reflection of certain communities because police have concentrated their efforts in those particular communities. So that was one of the things that the station cited in terms of coming up with this policy. And I know the Missourian has done it for that reason, and there are other news organizations around the country that's done it. It's sad that here we are in 2020 and we're still talking about this when these kinds of actions should have been eliminated from news organization years ago.
So now we got to this, what's going on in New Hampshire, where there is legislation in the House there that it would require that news organizations, newspapers, television stations, radio stations go back and correct stories when somebody is either convicted of a lesser charge than what they were originally charged with, or if there was found that they were not guilty in the first place,
or
if the charges are dropped, or if the case was dismissed entirely. And I can see some good reasons for doing that, correcting the record, updating stories. What kind of a burden does that put on news organizations, though, that may not otherwise follow a case all the way to the end?
Yeah, it's a huge burden, especially in newsrooms that have been hollowed out, as we've talked about in this show. And it's really not correcting the story, it's actually updating.
Right.
It would be a government mandate for an update. Now, I agree with you, Amy. I think the motivations are good, but I think what this says to us as the media is we really need to, especially in a digital age when these kind of things are easily accessible and they kind of hang around on the internet for a long time, it's really on us to police our own backyard, or else we're going to get policed. And as somebody who is a defender of the First Amendment, I don't like to see the government meddling in the way news is covered. We are the fourth estate. We should be independent. But if we want to keep that independence, we really have to be proactive about making sure we do those kinds of things. I don't think there's anything wrong with what the legislature wants except the mandate, because it does put a big burden
Ernest,
on news organizations.
Let me ask you this then, Ernest, as a former Cops and Courts reporter. Mm-hmm. Does a bill like this, or even the idea or support behind it, maybe challenge us as journalists to be more judicious about what crime stories we choose to cover in the first place? So that if we're going to cover it, we should almost be committing to see it through to the end, as opposed to taking every cheap crime story and putting it in the paper or on TV.
I think this kind of legislation would do that. Mm-hmm. Because as Kathy pointed out, newsrooms have been hollowed out. You don't have that kind of staff. So if you know that somewhere down the line you're going to have to go back and number one, you're going to have to follow that story into its conclusion to make sure that you have met the mandates of the law, then you're going to be really conscious about what stories you're going to put out there and what stories you aren't. We can go back to the mugshots. Mm-hmm. You see television stations and newspapers every day will just do sort of a data dump on the crime blotter and not pay much attention as to what happens afterwards, what happens in the next step. And this kind of mandate would force them to either to keep following up on that or not to do it at all.
Okay, so our next topic. Kathy, you sat down last week when we were getting ready to tape and you said, the real news, what we really should be talking about right now is that Harry and Meghan have announced they're walking away from their royal duties. I looked at you, I rolled my eyes, said, and I focused on the ballistic missiles that had been falling in Iran. Well, now that more time is passing and we're reading more of the stories that are coming out on the royal family's emergency summit, I've had some fresh eyes on this. I'm getting a better sense of why. A big part of it has been the scrutiny that this couple has faced at every turn. And Monday night, BuzzFeed had a great piece. It's on our Links blog right now, where you can take a look at different stories that have been done by the British press at different points in each couple's, life cycle, if you will, at the same point in the pregnancy with Kate and with Meghan, and the way they handled hands on the baby bump or flowers in the Abbey. And you can really see the scrutiny and the racism that has been baked in here.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some stories, not as many as I thought would be, but there have been stories out there where people have gone into neighborhoods and into communities of color in Great Britain, and the people in those communities saying, this has been there all along. Why is it now that the British media is now starting to pay attention to this? And yes, there is a racial undertone to a lot of the coverage, and it's been there for a while. And communities of color in Britain have recognized that and have spoken out about it. But until this, they weren't getting that kind of attention, and now it's starting to come out.
Yeah, I thought the BuzzFeed piece was devastating. It was just absolutely crystal clear what's going on, the double standard. And I think that there's racism involved, there's classism involved, and there's sexism involved. And that's a toxic recipe that unfortunately a lot of the British tabloids specialize in. And so, I think unfortunately for Meghan and Harry, by doing this, they're actually going to get more attention.
I agree with you.
And they're going to become even bigger targets. But they may also have done a public service by sparking the kind of conversations that Earnest was talking about that haven't been had so far.
Do you think they're going to be had, though?
Well, I think that. Well,
I can understand what you're saying, and I can appreciate it. I have to wonder if those conversations are actually going to happen.
Well, they're having the conversations now, but they're having the conversations that center around the two of them and whether or not they should or should not be a part of the monarchy. Do we get to an even deeper conversation about how people of color are covered, whether they are the royals or whether they are regular citizens? That's the conversation that I'm not sure we're going to have because we haven't had it before. We'll have it in these times of crisis or when something like this comes up that sort of puts it out there for everybody to see. But then something else comes up. Iran comes up. The election comes up. Donald Trump's next tweet comes up, and then we move on to something else.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, I think Meghan Markle has done her part. I mean, she's put it out there, and she was very explicit. She didn't hold back. So, I think the challenge is now on the British media. How are they going to meet it, and how are they going to respond?
Okay, I've got another issue that is baked somewhat in racism in the media, not necessarily the news media, but this one having to do with the Romance Writers of America, a trade organization I did not even know existed until yesterday, but a really big shakeup there with the way that people from different communities in romance novels that are written in both set in contemporary times and in the past are portraying different communities, people from different areas, and it has caused a huge rift within that organization with its leadership walking away.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you had one of the board members who is Chinese American, who was upset about the way in which Chinese Americans were portrayed in another author's romance novel, pointed that out. They have an ethics board that is a part of this organization, which she sat on. She basically recused herself from that decision, and then they came back out and basically dumped on her and said, "No, you were wrong. You shouldn't have done this." And the whole organization is in an uproar because of that, to the point where you have major publishers who have pulled away from this organization and have refused to support them in their next conference. I mean, this has the potential to basically devastate this organization, and it's all because you can't get people to sit around a table and say, okay, let's have a conversation about this in the open and be transparent about who we are and what we are as an organization.
Yeah, and that was the other part of the problem. The decision was made in a very non-transparent way. And, I think going back to the beginning conversation we were having about the impeachment trials, it's the cover-up that always gets you in trouble.
Doing it behind closed doors.
Be open and be transparent. And that's, one of the things as media representatives, I always say to people, we're your hall monitors. You should be grateful to us because you never pick your nose if somebody's looking at you. Our observation raises the level of behavior. And I think having done this behind closed doors, that's immediately a sign of trouble.
So another one of these questions we ask a lot at this table in many different contexts is, where were the adults in the room? Where were the grown-ups? And as I was reading through this, one of the other questions I had was, this is really bad for this organization. Where were the people at the publishers, and why wasn't this also being addressed at the publisher level as well? Because they're the ones who are ultimately publishing and selling these books, not the professional organization.
It's that last point you just made, selling these books. So, there's a market there. And if you're always playing to the market without making sure you understand who the market is and what the market really wants, you will find yourself in a situation where you get burned. And here is one of those situations where you're playing to this particular market over here, but then you're discriminating against, or you're stereotyping this market over here, and ultimately you wind up losing both if you aren't paying attention.
Okay. Oprah Winfrey. She has said she is stepping down as the executive producer of a documentary that centers on sexual misconduct accusations against Russell Simmons. That film is set to debut at the Sundance Film Festival next month and was then going to be on the Apple Plus streaming platform. That release has been canceled. Why is Oprah doing this? Because we know more than anything she's going to protect her brand, right? That's Oprah Winfrey. She was an executive producer on Finding Neverland. She was an executive producer on some of these other documentaries about accusers. Why step back from Russell Simmons?
I'm really puzzled, and she says it's because of creative differences with the directors, which, these things do happen. But this is really late in the game, and it comes after an Instagram appeal, an open letter to Oprah by Russell Simmons, and I think that, I don't know, but I think it's not a good look.
And for Oprah or for Russell Simmons?
For Oprah.
Okay.
This is totally not a good look for Russell Simmons. I mean, keep in mind, this is a guy who, after initially protesting and denying and saying he was the victim of a terrible smear campaign, has now come around and said, oh, yeah, maybe, I did some things that I shouldn't have. So, I don't, this is not somebody who's a complete innocent. So it's really puzzling. And, these kinds of movies have I think, really pushed the movement, because if you talk about Surviving R. Kelly, if you talk about Bombshell, I think it gives people sort of the documentary style. It's like a magazine story. It gives people a much more intimate feel for what these women went through. So I'm surprised that she's pulling out and without more explicit explanation.
Yeah, I'm also surprised that, I understand she has an agreement with Apple in terms of what from her production company will come in, but I think this also could be a blemish on Apple, because they could easily go out and cut a separate deal with the two producers of this documentary and run it anyway. So I'm a little surprised by the fact that Apple didn't just say, yeah, we know this is not a part of your operation right now, Oprah, but we think it's important enough for us to put this on our streaming service.
Yeah, it just has this feel of the Insiders Club, taking care of each other, and that's what's discomforting about it.
Right.
Okay, so Monday morning, the Oscar nominations came out, and it looks like we're right back where we started before Will and Jada Pinkett Smith started Oscars So White back in 2015. A cohort that, with some of these great films out there like Little Women, not a single woman in the Best Director category.
Yeah, 2 years. In 2 years? In 2 years, you went from
it was 4.5 or 5, but still, it doesn't matter. We've taken 6 steps back.
Yeah, I know. I can't understand for the life of me why they can't see this. I mean, they all know what the nominations are. They all see it. Can't they go back in the room and go like, wait a minute, this is not going to work. Let's try this again. But nope, they put it out there and they set themselves up for this again. And here we go. I just don't get it. I don't have an answer for it.
The tone deafness, I think, and again, it gets back to what you were saying about the situation in Great Britain. Will people have the conversation after things like this happen? After Oscar So White, people, people resolve. We're going to get better.
Time's up,
and then the backsliding is, and sometimes the backsliding takes you back further than you were to start out with. So I think it's the man said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Well, the price of equality, the price of justice is also eternal vigilance. And I know people get tired of hearing about this, but if you don't continually keep the pressure on, people backslide.
So I think about this. It's been, 1 or 2 years since Black Panther was up for Best Picture. Mm-hmm. Do we start voting with our dollars then? Do we stop going to movies? Do we stop supporting? How do you get around this?
I think it's going to be interesting because if you look at the movies that were nominated, a lot of them are being put out by streaming services. Uh-huh. And so it's moving more and more in that direction. And I think that's where you're probably going to see things happen in terms of the pocketbook, because people are just going to go, well, okay, if Netflix is going to do that, then I'm not going to do that. I'll go to Apple, I'll go here. And it's not going to show up in that box office, but it's going to show up in whether or not certain groups will stream with this streaming service as opposed to this one.
Well, and what'll be interesting is to see who picks up this movie. Because I would assume, unless there's some kind of a contractual, you can't touch, that somebody will pick it up.
And
in a way, Oprah's just given them a huge gift of publicity.
Right.
So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and
I'll definitely watch it.
And I think the same thing is going to happen in terms of what happens with the Oscars. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're going to have streaming services that understand the audience, and they're going to succeed. And then ultimately they will get those awards.
Okay. Before we go, we've got a funny commercial for you from a regional fan favorite.
Taking French onion soup off the menu has really taken a toll on our social media team. We had to hire extra help to deal with all the comments.
At Panera Bread, bring back French onion soup, you cowards. Yeah. Okay. You should be ashamed of yourselves. I am. At Panera doesn't have French onion soup, and this is mid-key ruining my life. Okay. I just want some French onion soup at Panera Bread. You. Wow. Terrible.
Needless to say, everyone's really happy that French onion soup is officially back. Please stop messaging us.
So that was St. Louis native Phyllis Smith reading the mean tweets, reprising her role of Phyllis from the NBC hit The Office. I had Ernest over here laughing as we were watching it. And as a fan of The Office and of Phyllis and of Panera's French onion soup, I saw this and I thought this is just the greatest way to tap into the local zeitgeist.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Office. I don't watch it all the time, but that was a pretty funny commercial. That's a good way to deal with the controversy.
Okay, well, we are out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about the topics we talked about on our links blog under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan, KBIA's Aaron Hay, and Tim Pilcher for our audio music.